Thank you so much, Dwight. And thank you all for being here, for your time and your attention. So I'd like to share a PowerPoint, if I may, real quick, just to have something to look at. Okay, so allow me to start with an anecdote. My brother is a 31-year-old immigrant from the Dominican Republic. He is a grocery store worker in East Harlem, New York, where since August, 1 in 10 residents tested positive for COVID-19. Every day he commutes to work from East New York, Brooklyn, another hot zone, where he lives in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with his in-laws, wife, their 3-year-old son, and newborn. 2 days prior writing this article, I asked him how he was feeling. He told me that he was, quote, coming down with a cold. The following day, he called to tell me that he couldn't taste snow. I asked him if he would go into work, and he explained, I'm an essential worker, so I have to go in. Over the phone, I overheard my 3-year-old nephew in the background playing with his favorite toy dinosaurs. That evening, my brother's father-in-law developed alarming COVID symptoms, including a fever of 104 and a persistent cough. As a precautionary measure, my brother and his father-in-law quarantined in one of the rooms. I couldn't help but be afraid. A deep sense of powerlessness and anxiety are the symptoms of my relative privilege as I speak to him from the safety of my socially distanced apartment. Earlier this year, New York City was the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. With over 240,000 COVID-19 cases, including more than 23,743 deaths, the 5 boroughs became a hot zone for the novel coronavirus. Since then, the epicenter has shifted to other high-density immigrant cities, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Miami, and Dallas. For the more than 10 million undocumented immigrants in the US, the pandemic exacerbates pre-existing structures of oppression, including concentrated poverty, legal inequality, and unreliable healthcare. These morally unjust realities provide fertile ground for COVID-19 to spread among this vulnerable community. While many work from home and practice social distancing, undocumented immigrants, already disenfranchised and marginalized demographic, face unprecedented legal, health, and economic risks that will linger far longer than the duration of this pandemic. How then are undocumented immigrants to navigate and survive this frightening healthcare crisis? Undocumented immigrants working in the food and agriculture sector are one of the most precarious groups when it comes to COVID-19 infection. This quote essential workforce comprises workers who sell, produce, and distribute food and other essential products. Reports from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and World Health Organization show that social distancing and quarantine can mitigate this pandemic and keep oneself and one's loved ones safe from infection. Yet there are hundreds of thousands of essential workers who cannot quarantine or adequately practice social distancing because of their busy work environments and economic insecurity. According to the US Bureau of Labor and Statistics, only 13% of the Latinx workforce can work from home. This number dramatically shrinks when we consider undocumented Latinx immigrants. In New York City, Latinx immigrants make up more than 23% of the population. 18% of the city's immigrants are undocumented. This percentage roughly amounts to more than 500,000 individuals, many of whom work in essential jobs like the food, agricultural, and janitorial sectors. At home, on their way to work and at their jobs, essential workers encountered hundreds of potential carriers of COVID-19 on a daily basis. Reports show the Latinx essential workers are testing positive for COVID-19 infection at higher rate than other workers in similar jobs. In San Francisco, Unidos en Salud, United in Health, a collaboration between UC San Francisco and the Latino Task Force on COVID-19, identified the outsized exposure risk facing Latinx essential workers and their families in the Mission District, driven in part by inequality in economic and housing security. Their July study shows continued unmet demand for access to testing. Quote, the initiative tested 2,622 people at the busy 24th Street Mission BART Plaza in 6 half-day sessions, at an average rate of 100 tests per hour. Overall, 9%, 235 people, of the PCR-based tests came back positive for SARS-CoV-2 infection, with a test positivity rate of 11% among Latinx participants. San Francisco's overall test positivity rate is currently 2.61%, according to the Department of Public Health. The vast majority of those who tested positive at the transit hub sites are Latinx, 93%. Speak Spanish as their preferred language, 85%. Earn income less than $50,000 a year, 87%. And live in high-density households, 79%. People from across the Bay Area were tested at the plaza, and most positive results were seen in residents of the Mission or Southeast San Francisco, end quote. Correlations between COVID infection and national security cannot be overlooked in discussions of undocumented people in this country. For many undocumented essential workers, public exposure puts them at risk of being targeted by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. On March 18th, ICE updated their website, stating it, quote, will temporarily adjust its enforcement posture, and its temporary priorities are to promote life-saving and public safety activities. The divisive rhetoric that has come to define ICE in the current administration cannot be reversed with a simple addendum to a website, especially when ICE continues to detain immigrants during this crisis. On the same date that ICE updated its policies, the New York Times reported that, quote, ICE agents over the past week have continued to make arrests in some of the regions hardest hit by the virus, including California and New York. ICE's enforcement posture is a paradox that catalyzes the deeply rooted skepticism migrants have for this agency. How could ICE, for instance, protect the health of undocumented people and simultaneously refuse them the fundamental human rights of migration? This paradox thwarts all efforts to safeguard the most vulnerable. For undocumented immigrants with underlying health conditions, the possibility of deportation exacerbates their biological and psychological health, making these individuals more defenseless against a virus that is ravaging their workplace, neighborhoods, and homes. Over the phone, my brother tells me people at my job are getting sick. They know what symptoms to look for, a fever, a cough, so they take time off. I asked him if they are getting tested. He replies, many of them are undocumented and won't risk going to the doctor. They are afraid of being deported. I listen, contemplating what risk and fear mean to me. I try to empathize, and yet I feel incapable from my place of relative safety and security. In a recent article published in the New England Journal of Medicine, Kathleen R. Page and others remind us that undocumented immigrants' fear of government is justified. Quote, under the Trump administration, immigrants have faced relentless attacks, tightening of the public charge rule, threats to the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, DACA, raids by immigration by ICE, asylum restrictions, and separation of families at the border. So immigrants are justifiably scared. Expecting them to trust the government now during the COVID-19 crisis is naive at best. As community organizations, activists, and healthcare providers scramble to reach out to immigrants and encourage them to seek care for COVID-19 if necessary, we are using mitigation strategies that will not compensate for years of harm. End quote. Fear can also be deadly. Studies on the anxiety and depression of BIPOC communities show substantial links between biological and psychological health. According to Heidi Castañeda, the stress of possible deportation and separation from family members directly affects the psychological and biological health of undocumented immigrants. Castañeda argues, quote, hostile policy environments result in intense feelings of anxiety, fear, and depression, which exacerbate pre-existing health conditions such as high blood pressure and diabetes, end quote. Harboring this kind of animus can raise a person's blood pressure and cortisol levels. Quote, high levels of everyday discrimination contribute to narrowing the arteries over time, argues the Harvard social scientist David R. Williams. Quote, high levels of discrimination lead to higher levels of inflammation, a marker of heart disease, end quote. Even though the CDC has made it clear that those with underlying medical conditions are most at risk of severe illness and death from COVID-19, more needs to be done to quell the social conditions that exacerbate underlying health conditions, particularly for immigrant communities. In addition to facing unprecedented legal and health risks, undocumented immigrants are confronting an economic crisis as well. The Pew Research Center reports that, quote, US Latinos are among the hardest hit by pay cuts and job losses due to coronavirus, end quote. In April, nearly 50% of Latinx people in the US reported that they or someone in their household have lost a job or taken a pay cut due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This study, however, does not account for undocumented people who often live in the shadows of society out of fear of deportation. What we do know, according to a Pew Center Pew survey in April and May, is that 73% of all US citizens across racial and ethnic groups generally believe that Latinx immigrants, whether undocumented or not, work in jobs that US citizens do not want. We should keep in mind that the definitions of undesirable jobs among Americans have changed with the pandemic as workers factor in safety concerns, making essential jobs in busy environments less desirable than they were before the pandemic. In many cases, it isn't that undocumented immigrants are willing to work such jobs, but that many workers have no other choice but to work them, even if they have COVID-19 symptoms. Furthermore, the Pew Center's April-May survey found most Americans say that while the federal government should provide medical help, it does not have a responsibility to provide economic help to undocumented immigrants who have lost their job due to the outbreak. These results suggest that most Americans don't see a correlation between medical and economic help, or that this correlation does not apply to undocumented people. Yet, we know that when it comes to a virus that in busy work environments, particularly between immigrant communities that are overrepresented among essential workers, economic stability and the health of people are inseparable. Undocumented immigrants, after all, are willing to risk their health and potentially spread the virus because many of them are financially insecure. This lack of empathy is dangerous to the health of the US and the world. As COVID-19 cases continue to soar in cities with sizable undocumented immigrant populations, the negative impact of anti-immigration policies on public health cannot be overlooked. Without adequate care for all in danger of COVID-19 infection, containment of this virus, as we have seen, will be an unrealistic endeavor. The federal government has not issued any orders for aiding undocumented immigrants living and working on the margins of US society. First, undocumented immigrant people don't qualify for the Trump administration's coronavirus relief package. NPR reports, quote, the legislation which provides one-time cash payments to low and middle income households excludes immigrants in the country illegally, as well as children who are US citizens but have at least one parent who is undocumented, end quote. Secondly, undocumented immigrants legally cannot collect unemployment insurance. As of May, over 33 million Americans have filed for unemployment. So while US citizens and documented immigrants receive financial help from the federal government, millions of undocumented people now must figure out other ways to make ends meet. Many will have to dip into their savings to pay their rent and or buy food. Others who live paycheck to paycheck will have even fewer options. So what does this financial and legal uncertainty mean for the more than 10 million undocumented immigrants in the US? Do undocumented essential workers, like the ones who work with my brother, have no choice but to weather the medical and economic storm that continually worsens? The call of our era is for active allyship from those in power, a moral duty to develop what Isabel Wilkerson calls radical empathy. Empathy is not sympathy, Wilkerson states. Quote, sympathy is looking across at someone and feeling sorrow, often in times of loss. Empathy is not pity. Pity is looking down from above and feeling a distant sadness for another and their misfortune. Empathy is commonly viewed as putting yourself in someone else's shoes and imagining how you would feel. That could be seen as a start, but that is little more than role playing, and it is not enough in the ruptured world we live in. Wilkerson continues, radical empathy, on the other hand, means putting in the work to educate oneself and to listen with a humble heart to understand another's experience from their perspective, not as we imagine we would feel. Radical empathy is not about you and what you think you would do in a situation you have never been in and perhaps never will. It is the kindred connection from a place of deep knowing that opens your spirit to the pain of another as they perceive it. Undocumented immigrants deserve more than our thoughts and prayers. They deserve radical empathy and action from us. It is morally inept and counterintuitive to not provide relief to all who need it. If the objective is, as the CDC puts it, to, quote, protect individuals at increased risk for severe illness, end quote, then we must truly support the most vulnerable and not simplistically base relief on one's legal status. The threat of deportation prevents many undocumented people from seeking the health care they need. As a result, they pose a great risk to themselves and others. Unless more Unless more state and federal government policies urge and support undocumented people, the danger of infection could increase for everyone, not just in this pandemic, but in future ones as well. Thank you all so much. And I just wanted to share this last page on places where one could donate and reach out to. But I'd love to take some questions now, I guess. And I'll stop sharing this now. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, any questions? Anyone? Again, remember, we are recording this, so if you don't want to be recorded, you can always type in your question. Otherwise, you're more than welcome just to turn on your mic and ask. One of the benefits of hosting these is I often take the advantage of being the first person to ask a question. I'm going to do that because I always have like a dozen questions. And first and foremost, I want to see, for me, it was really interesting that you first present the Pew Research data, and you could see that Pew broke it down into 3 important factors: age, gender, and then education is one of the most, and then you follow that up with this quote about radical empathy. So my question for you is, how do we do radical empathy in the classroom?
Yeah, and that's my approach always, because like, I always ask myself, well, what can I do? And it's really hard to teach anything like that, to teach radical empathy. But I think one thing that we can do is begin with, and especially in the humanities, for me, in my case, begin thinking about, like, what do we expose students to? What narratives in literature specifically do they have access to? And in that sense, just that's the type of representation that they can begin to sort of, like, in a sense, see themselves as. And I think that in doing that, you get to create a space where we can have these conversations in the classroom. I have noticed that talking about race, talking about immigration status, can be a difficult thing for students and for professors as well. And I think that in part is because we don't have often the language to have these conversations, or that we don't have them enough, essentially. But I do think that in the classroom, just one can start by first making students aware of this reality for undocumented people, how this might connect or to their own lives, but even if it does not, that that we should still create a space to unpack some of these inequalities, and then also providing the tools of language for thinking about undocumented people versus documented people. What type of languages could help them sort of unpack these complex ideas. But yeah, I think we can do a lot in the classroom. Radical empathy, like you said, you mentioned the education level. It can begin with educating ourselves, right? The more that we know, the more we can understand, and that extends to even people who might have completely different experiences than us. There's a question here or a comment. Or maybe, Dwight, you want to take a look at it, or can I just read it?
I can read it, or you can, either way.
Cool, I can go ahead and read it. So Raz says, maybe instead, rather than teaching radical empathy, we might ask, what can we do to help students unlearn normal? Yes, absolutely, right? Yes, thank you. What we can do to unlearn normal, right? Empathy. And I've been thinking a lot of the concept of normalcy has circulated a lot lately. When will we return to normal, right? And in that conversation, we've been talking a lot about the new normal, that things inevitably won't be normal as we know them. And I think that this is one of those things that we can talk about. If our normal is changing and evolving in terms of how we interact with people, in terms of how we teach in the classroom in so many levels, on so many levels, then we could also think about a new normal for empathy and how we can empathize with others who, as we know, in the case of this pandemic, are affected just as much as we are, regardless of our of their immigration or legal status or what have you. But I like this idea of unlearning. What does empathy look like for us? And I do think that, and I love that line from Wilkerson, that it needs to be a radical type of empathy, one that requires like active, doing, because of the situation and the ruptured world that we live in. Yeah, but I really like that idea, Raz.
If I may jump in real quick with another question, did we get an update on your brother and your brother's father-in-law?
No, so I can update you guys now. Luckily, they're well. I do follow up with him regularly, to touch base on how his how the people at his job are doing. And one of the most heartbreaking things is that there's been a lot of sort of like a lot of people who did leave because, or who took time off because they were sick, ended up not returning, either because they were they weren't rehired, because they didn't have time off, that they could take in a way that allowed them to return. But yeah, a lot of some of the folks who were there, I think in two cases, one of them passed away, and some of the other ones just did not return. So there's a sense of like lack of communication and even information in terms of like what's happening to these laborers, these workers, when they do get sick or sick enough when they have to be absent and leave. Like what happens to them next? That's something that's been troubling me a little bit. But luckily, my brother and his father-in-law are well. They're doing fine. Um, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, here on campus, if we miss, people are asking, how are you? How are things going? People are checking in on you. Imagine a world where you can't do that. You may not want people checking in on you
Right.
for fear, right? On the one
Yeah.
hand, yes, you do want that support. On the other hand, that support might be a threat. So yeah, when you talk to them, how do they see you writing about this? Do they think that this is going to be useful? They're there at ground zero, and you're, kind of in your ivory tower writing about this stuff. Do they see you as a voice that's going to help this situation, or is it hard for them to relate to?
That is a really good question. So I can only speak, I guess, for my brother and my mother, who are the sources, who are the people that I really interviewed. And I think that at least for them, it's not so much a question of like, is this going to change anything, or um, am I putting anyone at risk? Because they're not. My brother he's documented, but the people that he's working with, a lot of them are not. Um, but I do try to communicate that, because it does feel very selfish of me to be writing, um, recording their lives, from, like I said, like my socially distanced apartment where I can, be safe and not worry too much about getting infected. Although we do get infected as well, as we know, even if you are socially, if you practice all the things, you're still at risk. Um, but I do try to communicate that to them, that I am trying to create awareness, to show that, this demographic of people who are usually seen as undesirable, unwanted, etc., are on the front lines, essentially working these jobs that are quote unquote essential, but are often, in the shadows of society when it comes to healthcare. And just to kind of like, create a different, like, sort of like, I guess, ethos, when it comes to thinking about undocumented people, now. But I don't know. I don't know how. I haven't really asked them that question. Like, what do you guys think I'm doing with this? I think that a lot of them I haven't had a chance to talk to directly to undocumented people because of this fear of, of immigration, of ICE, of being deported. So it's always like through, my family that I get to hear these stories. I think Andrew has a point, a comment on new normal. It seems like for neighborhoods like East New York, some of the same things that made the neighborhood a good place to live have contributed to contagion. Right. Yeah. Are you concerned about the neighborhood's character changing in some irreversible way? And I guess that sort of makes me think of like, what are the things that that have made it a neighborhood good to live in? Maybe like community. Um, these places can be safe, right, for undocumented people, right? Because the particular neighborhood that I'm talking about in East New York is very high density immigrant uh, neighborhood. Um, any characters that changing in irreversible ways? I'm not sure. I'm not really sure what's going to happen. Before the pandemic, these neighborhoods were quickly gentrifying, and questions of, of economic injustice and inequality among the residents. That was already a thing, right? That was pushing a lot of folks out. Um, I think that with this pandemic, what we're being introduced to is like, another side that we're being introduced to, or that's being exacerbated, are these like economic injustices. How will people afford to pay rent on apartments that are quickly like that are quickly becoming unaffordable for these people? Like, so I think that when we're thinking about, and I say this in the piece, right? This like this health crisis, we have to think about the economic crisis that is often, that are these things are often intersecting with one another. So I don't know. I think that, a lot of people, and I can talk for my family, are still out of work or are working a lot less than they were. A lot of them are afraid of being evicted. A lot of them are unable to pay their rent now. And although there are some eviction laws that are preventing landowners from, evicting them, there's always that overriding anxiety that how can I trust even these laws that are keeping me from being evicted? So a lot of people that I know actually are still paying their rent, even if it's running them financially to the ground. So I do expect the irreversible changes to be related to housing, and further displacing these communities into like sort of disparate areas where maybe in thinking about undocumented people, they won't be as protected, right? The communities that they might go into won't be, sanctuaries, I guess, for lack of a better word. And yeah, that could be something that I would love to keep my eye on in the future.
You have another question. I'll read this one.
Yeah.
I don't mean to change topics, especially given the importance of it, but it'd be great if we could hear more about some of your other work, given you're new to the university. That is a good question.
Cool. So like, and I was talking to Dwight earlier, a lot of this work sounds, very like sociologically based. And this really, was inadvertent. This work comes from like my curiosity for people I know and how they were being affected during the pandemic, and really shining a bright light on that. But the work that I do is mostly based on 19th century Latinx cultural production. So like I work on uh, thinking about how cultural production of Latino, Latinx, Latina people in the United States sort of works as a mode of community building, identity formation in the United States. So I do a lot of translation work. I look at a lot of newspapers, pamphlets, whatever's available. Because one of the things with when you're looking at 19th century cultural production overall, you run into this issue of archival fragmentation that makes it really difficult to provide a story, right, of these people the way that you would see it, for instance, in like in the Anglophone, like you know um, I guess in Anglophone cultural production, it's a little more difficult. So yeah, I work in the 19th century on Latinx writers, texts, and I'm working on a book right now, on two books, one of which looks at newspaper poetry as a form of public discourse. So I look at both English and Spanish. Um, and so newspaper poetry as being informative to things like financial panics, outbreaks and epidemics, and also the I guess the conception of the celebrity in the 19th century. So yeah, I do a lot of work in the 19th century to I guess to just end that comment. But I do look forward to working with with other folks here. I'm all about like thinking in terms of interdisciplinary work. So I just arrived in the fall this semester, so I'm still getting to know people and learning more about the university.
Yeah, we should say welcome to UT too. I neglected to mention that. I hope you're settling into Toledo. Is it? I mean, it's kind of a weird time to be settling in, right? It's not the
Yeah.
same, but
So yeah, I did my doctoral work at Ohio State. So while I'm not familiar, I guess very familiar with Northwest Ohio, I know a little bit of about Ohio. So, and again, it was sort of I guess serendipitous to move out of New York City during the height of the pandemic. Again, it was interesting because it was both like I knew I was making this decision out of safety reasons and things like that, but I had this sort of overriding guilt about like leaving, right, when things were getting worse there. And again, this might return to Andrew Madison's comment and question about what are the challenges of that many of these people face, and that's that a lot of them, if they leave because they have to, not out of choice like I did. But yeah, in terms of settling here, I found it it's not as hard as settling in New York City. Let's just put it like that.
that's something we can wear on our sleeves. Yeah, I think you've got to mention that, and this is a theme that's been coming up a lot in the presentations. A lot of us are addressing our privilege and feeling the sense of discomfort that we're able to analyze the situation and make some sense of it, but we also feel powerless about it. And I think you mentioned that earlier as well. You're not the first person to say that. Yep. And I know I struggle with it too. But it is, for me as a sociologist, it's exciting to see people from other disciplines doing work similar to what we do. And actually, Dr. Simon from Foreign Languages is going to be speaking on his work with Arabic immigrants. I think in 1 week, I think he speaks. And I've seen some of his work before. It's really fascinating stuff. So it's a little bit humbling too, to see people from other disciplines doing our job and doing it really well. So I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I mean, again, like it's hard to like. It's funny, as I was putting this together, I'm like, yeah, well, I'm going to be speaking to probably some sociologists and anthropologists. I'm like, oh, this is really intimidating. And usually I approach, like all like literary people, my arguments through literature. But as this is something that's happening now. And I wanted to seriously think about a way to write something that was publicly facing, that was also relevant, and it drove me to looking at the available data, and then to narrativize that data, right, through interviews. And I just so happened to, it was just such a pressing thing in my case that I needed I needed to I guess verbalize it, and it led me to I guess to this kind of work. So Rez has another comment here. I'm interested in the distinction between definitions of empathy and what being productive means. Could you speak a bit on what being, quote, productive in this context means, or what it looks like for students and for educators? Um, that's a really good question, although I'm a little confused maybe as to what you mean by productive. Um, but I guess I could speak to that question in terms of like what's helpful, right? In this context, and it's like, well, when you think about what can be helpful in aiding like a pandemic, and we think about like our limited, abilities as researchers, scholars, and teachers. It's all sort of like for us, like ideological. Like you think it's all like, it's all theoretical. We're not, or at least I'm not, right? Like, like on the front lines of this in the sense that medical professionals and scientists are. So like in terms of like what's helpful, what's productive in that regard, I think, but that still leaves us a lot to work with because as Dwight says, right, put it earlier, we have to make sense of what this moment means to us culturally, so and socially, right? Um, we're in this like unique place where we can actually, you know, uh, uh, as we live through it, we can try to make sense of it, and then have something for posterity as we look back, at this moment. But I think in the classroom, again, I think that's why it's important to diversify our curriculum, to provide students with the language that they need. Like, what's the difference between like why we should use terms like documented and undocumented versus legal and illegal. These sort of like you know foundational yet basic questions and ideas that will help students and us, I think, productively talk about these issues. But again, I think that we're also, I can speak for myself, like as we're thinking about how to make sense of this moment, we're also trying to come up with ways to be productive about it, right? So that's to say that I don't have the answers to that. That I think that we're still figuring it out as we go along. You're welcome, Daria. And let's see, you have a question here. Daria is one of my students, so thank you for being here. um, are you aware of any Latinx authors who write about the Latinx experience in the pandemic? So not, I guess, this current pandemic. I do, as is usually the case, foresee a lot of writers, including Latinx writers, you know, writing about this moment in their fiction, poetry, um, and even nonfiction. Um, I can definitely send you a list. I think there are some poems that I'm blanking out on that have been recently published. Um, and Jose, how would you stomach, understand an argument from people claiming to need radical empathy themselves when they are willingly ignorant, resistant to these issues? That's a really, really good question. And that is a question that speaks to a lot of the social uprising for Black lives that are taking place right now, which are, these protests are inseparable from conversations about health and economic well-being. It's a tough, it's, whether I can stomach it. I try to, as an educator, I try to express radical empathy as a teacher and try and do my best to provide my students with arguments like and evidence for why we are focusing, for instance, on why Black Lives Matter now, right? Why this is such an important thing for us to talk about as opposed to other questions. But it's really, really difficult. Oftentimes I'm at a loss for words in terms of like, because as you put it, like this willful ignorance and resistance, that is often something that won't change in like a class or anything like that. And it requires like the work of the other person as well to reach some kind of like a place of learning, of growth. But I do what I can, right? And in that regard, like I said, I just provide them with the language, right? Provide them with, in my case, the literature, the space for productive conversation that is always, and for me, respecting of different identities, different people, etc. But it's like an impossible question to answer, right? Like we do our best, right? And we hope that our best is enough. Uh, but it's hard, as people say, like teaching radical empathy is as let me see, was it Rez who said this? Yes, is probably more about unlearning normal empathy, and how much of empathy has to do with one's own like subjectivity, one's race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and really thinking outside of that, blowing that out. Like, it's not just, that's not what radical empathy is. That's just sort of being like like empathetic, yeah, that's a tough one, Jose. Yeah. I wonder what other people feel about that. I'd love to hear from other folks. Um,
Yeah, anybody else got any takes on that? I'll throw my 2 cents. I would guess when you see people like that, they might be a little bit conflicted within themselves. And there's a battle going on inside them. And maybe they do want to open up and be more aware, more sensitive. On the other hand, maybe they've been inculcated with that resistance for a long time. And so you'll hear both voices speaking sometimes within the same sentence as they struggle with this themselves.
Absolutely.
I don't know, anybody else? Or does anyone have any other questions?
Oh, cool. So, Daria, if you're still here, Kim Mack, Professor Mack, posted a piece that you might want to take a look at on Jasmine. Yes, thank you, Jasmine Ward in Vanity Fair. Check that out, Daria.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and thanks also for the comment. It's important to introduce the science, like you said, right?
Yeah.
Present people with the facts.
I think that regardless of like, I mean, not regardless of, but in addition to our personal experiences and the biases that we carry, our internal monologues and conflicts, something. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but there's something about science that usually, right, creates a response from people. Now, what happens when science becomes politicized? What happens when scientific methods, scientific reasoning, etc., become part of a certain like political agenda or are masquerade as such, right? Then that presents another sort of like layer that we need to peel back on, right? It becomes this whole thing about, and we see this a lot in the media of a lot like skepticism toward like higher education. Like I feel there's a lot of that happening now, which is very divisive and dangerous. But yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of, for instance, now we've seen this sort of like attack on like, concepts and ideas that we have for a long time been building in academia, like critical race theory, as an example, right? Which has, created so much in terms of like positions and conversations and studies that we didn't have and we couldn't have before, right? So like this is, I feel like this attack on science, on education, on rational thinking, etc., which is another thing that we have as instructors and teachers, we have to factor into the conversation as we think about our students coming in, right? Like these are some obviously some biases that they could have, right? That are inculcated, as Dwight says. These are part of the internal, monologues, that they're having. I feel like there's a lot to talk about after the moment. When a pandemic meets a an election, when it meets over moments of social uprising, there's a lot to unpack here. But I do feel that that we will make sense of it, obviously, as it goes on.
Actually, you said that really well. And yes, I've been telling, and when I talk about it, I keep saying to people that this isn't just a public health crisis. This is a political crisis we're experiencing right now. And so really, yeah, the two things have crashed together. And that's why we have a higher death rate than so many other countries, I think. But yeah, it definitely complicates it. Other comments or questions? We're running out of time, but does anybody have any last minute questions or comments? Okay, this is a great conversation. So, Dr. Bonifacio, thank you again so much. Really appreciate this.
Thank you, Dwight, and thank all of you for your comments and for your attention and time. If you see me in the virtual space, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you see me on campus. My email is ayendy.bonifacio@UToledo. Please email me with any questions, what have you, and concerns. I'm glad to be here. And thank you, Dwight, for inviting me, for allowing me to speak here. This is I think it's so necessary right now, to have this space for these types of conversations. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, the fact that you got so many of your students to attend, I think, says something about you. That's great. I don't know if any of mine would attend if I spoke, but no, this is really great. Yeah, someday when everybody's back on campus, we should get together and do lunch.
Absolutely.
I'd love to hear more about your work. But in the meantime, I'll be in touch when we get this video up. Oh, I got to turn off the recording, by the way. I should do that right now.